What is Bitcoin consensus? The consensus mechanism we have in Bitcoin is probably the only innovation Satoshi brought to this whole thing, because all the technology we use in Bitcoin was decades old. But if you want to be completely accurate, that's not actually true. It turns out that Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus is also used in aircrafts when they have to agree upon the state of all sensors. So it's not even this thing is necessarily new itself, but the innovation comes from the fact that Satoshi decided, hey, let's take all this cryptography, let's use this consensus mechanism, and then we update the state of the blockchain, and that's gonna be this truth, to say so, that all the nodes are supposed to agree upon. And this is pretty much what Satoshi did and no one else before him did. But the interesting thing is that as incredible as this is, and as many things that this thing is unlocked, is very misunderstood. And there's a few reasons why this is misunderstood. First of all, it's a very counterintuitive thing, even though you do have human consensus and kind of follows the same kind of like principles. It's not really the same when it comes to how Bitcoin knows reach consensus. Secondly, on purpose, there's no like place where you can go and see a list of consensus, right? If you try to find on the internet a list of like what is Bitcoin consensus, there's no such list. The consensus is in the code. And you might be thinking like, how can this happen? How can Bitcoin exist for so many years and we don't have an exhaustive list of what makes up Bitcoin consensus? Well, there's a few reasons for this. And the main reason for this is because, well, there's a difference between what you want the software to do and what the software will do. And there's this flimsiness because you could say these are the consensus rules that all the nodes should abide, but for some reason, because there's like a implementation mishap or bug or something like this, it will do completely something else. And now, since all the nodes on the network are actually running this buggy software, even though we would have the correct thing happening on this list here, it may just not do the same thing. So instead of like instead of risking a network halt or a chain split or something like this, clearly the actual thing that we should go by is what's in the code and what most of the nodes run anyway. And this has happened multiple times in history of Bitcoin, and that's why people said instead of having another place that would just cause even more confusion, whatever is in the code, that's what the consensus thing is gonna be. And there's also this kind of thing which I feel like a lot of people who work on a Bitcoin core project, because let's be honest, core is mostly used and that's what pretty much defines consensus. I don't think they want to sit down and be like, hey, I'm gonna write this list here just to avoid any attack vectors. We're already to a bad start, because if you are a person who's completely intellectually honest and you would want to be like, hey, I want to understand how Bitcoin consensus works, there's no other place I can send you and be like, here, read this list and study this thing. You would have to go and read the code. Now, the second reason why the consensus thing is really hard to understand and define is because, let's just say you're very proficient in C++ and you're willing to take the time to understand how all these things work. You're going to have the added problem that there's second order effects of the consensus, and there's certain patches that get added to consensus, which they're not obvious. They're just not obvious. So you kind of have to be present here and kind of understand how these things go. And you have to have somewhat of an experience to kind of get to the point to really say, hey, I understand how this consensus thing works. And I know that maybe sounds a bit elitist or something like this, but this is a reality of the matter. And the third reason why consensus is quite hard to understand is that consensus itself is constrained. This is one thing I can tell you for sure in this video. Consensus is a set of constraints, and it's kind of weird to reason with constraints because consensus are filters, speaking of the big debate and whatever. Let me give you an example. If I would say right now, the consensus for women to walk into this room is they have to have naked boobs. And you look around and you see, and I can assure you they're not behind the camera, there's no women with naked boobs in this room. Now, you don't know if there were like 1,000 women at my doorstep and they were all willing to enter this room, but they didn't want to take off their top. So that's why they didn't enter the room. Or there were just no women, got my doorstep, because why would they be in the first place? And that's what consensus is, all boobs jokes aside. It's a set of constraints. The result of the consensus being enforced doesn't leave a trace of why or how the consensus was enforced. So because of these three things, that's why, it's hard to reason about consensus, and that's why a lot of people have a hard time defining what it is. So it's not necessarily that all the people are stupid or bad, even though most of the people are stupid and bad, but it's not that they start with bad intentions. There's just no place to kind of go and define this. So when you think about it like this, the only place we can start from is kind of reasoning that consensus is a set of constraints. And whatever Satoshi started off in the first place, and there's also that famous quote, I'm gonna kind of like paraphrase it, the good thing about Bitcoin is that once these rules start, they're kind of set in stone. So Satoshi started off with some of these rules, like there should be 21 million, the transaction should work in this way, what type of signatures, how a block should look like, how a transaction should look like, and there's all these set of rules and constraints that define what Bitcoin is. Now, as it so happens, because this Bitcoin is a software process, and a lot of people will want to make the statement that Bitcoin is somewhat alive, well, things that are alive change. And I'm saying as purely as a metaphor, please don't take it literally. But as things that are alive evolve, they need to change. And the thing is, like, I think it's pretty obvious how you can patch certain things in software, but because Bitcoin has this consensus thing, and like we said, consensus is a set of constraints, how do you add patches here? Since consensus is a set of constraints, the only way you can update consensus is by adding more constraints. You cannot relax the constraints. And the first person who I know of that came up with this idea and somewhat tried to formalize it with some kind of verbiage was Gavin Andresen. That's when the idea of a soft fork and a hard fork came about. They clearly understood that consensus is a set of constraints, and what's something that is very important for Bitcoin, we want all the constraints and all the changes we make, we want it to be backwards compatible, and we want to be able to like look at a current block and just kind of hop back to pretty much the Genesis block. And because of this, he came up with a definition of a hard fork and a soft fork. Soft fork being the one that most of the time, not always, but most of the time would be backwards compatible. And a hard fork, which pretty much almost always would end up in a chain split. But the way this was phrased, it was like a soft fork is a constraint of the rules and the hard fork is a relaxation of the rules. So what does this actually mean? If you have a series of nodes that abide by the first set of constraints, and then we loosen these constraints up, and we have another series of nodes who actually have a different set of allow for multiple types of transactions to be added to the blockchain. Well, in this instance, what's going to happen, you would result in a hard fork, because the nodes that have better constraints, that have tighter rules, are going to be like, we don't understand what this is, we're going to force this away. So the only way you can add constraints to the blockchain and make it backwards compatible is if you add more and more constraints to this whole thing. So every time we get a soft fork, you get more constraints. Now, I know this sounds very counterintuitive, because when you say you add more constraints, you said less things are valid. And how can that be true? How can we have less things be valid, but add additional functionality to Bitcoin? Another concrete example is like, so we had a certain type of transactions before SegWit. Now we add this new type of transactions, and somehow this is backwards compatible, and somehow you're telling me that less things are valid right now? This doesn't make any sense, because clearly we have another set of transactions. How could this actually be true? Well, the reason why this is actually true, and this is what I was talking about, getting to the specifics of things in second order effects, is that we added a new set of transactions, and for this specific set of transactions, we added a certain set of constraints. And that, I don't think that's philosophically inconsistent, but more importantly, it's not technically inconsistent, and it works on chain. So what ended up happening with this thing with SegWit specifically, we said, hey, let's add this new other set of transactions, which are SegWit transactions, which just say we're going to take the signature and add it in a different place. And it's for this specific set of transactions, we're going to add a new set of rules. And the rule is like, if you see this new type of SegWit transaction, don't just look for the signature where it is initially in the block, next to the transaction, look in this other part of the block. And that is a constraint, because the constraint is that if you would normally see these transactions, you would see them as anyone can spend, but in the specific case, if they have the SegWit marker, you have to look for the signature in a specific place. So this is an additional rule that was added, an additional constraint. This still leaves the question open, what is Bitcoin consensus? The only way you can kind of understand that is realistically, is just try to think of a lot of examples of things that could happen on the Bitcoin network, and then try to make an expectation of that, and then try to confront that against what's happening in the code. But even if you were to do that, that still wouldn't give you a lot of results. And this happened again, even with the people who are writing the software for this code, because even though you have a stated intention there, it may just not work like that. So you should probably try to kind of like understand what Bitcoin consensus is by coming up with some examples and running them against the code. But most importantly, you should just try to write a bunch of transactions and a lot of weird transactions that are really non-standard, and try to broadcast them and try to put them for a node and see what the node does. So I kind of pretty much am saying that you have no chance of understanding what Bitcoin consensus is, because even if you're a pretty decent developer, this would still be such a big effort. So you kind of have this situation where like the only way you kind of really will get a decent understanding of what Bitcoin consensus is just kind of like using Bitcoin for a lot of time and just trying to find all these edge cases and understand them over the years. But anyway, to conclude this video, there's only there's only one thing that I can concretely tell you. Consensus is a set of constraints, and the only way you can update consensus in a backwards compatible way is add more constraints. And the only other place, if someone was to go like, show me Bitcoin consensus, where is the Bitcoin consensus? Well, the only thing that you can also look at and say this is result of Bitcoin consensus is if you would look at the Bitcoin blocks. And if you look at the Bitcoin blocks, you can see this was a consequence, this is a trace of Bitcoin consensus being applied. But what you cannot say what the consensus filtered out. It's just impossible, because you would never know. Like right now, I could broadcast them all, so this is transaction, and it will not get in the blocks, but no one can ever know what was wrong about this transaction. I mean, the node that probably got it and said, I'm not adding this in my mempool, I'm not saying it to other nodes might know. Or if I go even more direct route, if I go to a specific miner, the miner might be like, I'm not gonna add this in the blocks, because if I add this in the blocks and I broadcast the blocks to other miners are not gonna build on my block, and then that means that I'm not gonna get money. And I don't want to do that, because I spent a lot of money trying to generate a hash from this block. So only way you can kind of reason about consensus is a set of constraints, and then you kind of have the trace of what the result of consensus was, but it doesn't really tell you what consensus is exactly. I mean, you can't look at a blockchain and reason to what are the consensus rules. You can just say this is what got past the consensus constraints, and that's all.